All right. All power is to oppress people, African power to an African people, and black power to your brother Yang and Kruma. Coming again in doing P.E.C, People's Education Committee, Politicals Education Committee, Power Education Committee, all the above. Doing the part two of Black Intelligentsia. I went back and watched the first one, a little choppiness in the frame, but the audio is pretty good. I hope that the people whom seek political education were able to benefit from it. But now we want to go to part two, Black Intelligentsia, again, reading from Idea Ndugu, comrade, idea brother, Muhammad Ahmad, formerly known as Maxwell Standford, founder of the Revolutionary Action Movement. We went into part one, a little bit of what the Black Intelligentsia was. Now we're going into part two, historical and philosophical roots of the Black Intelligentsia. Dr. Muhammad says, to understand the contradictions in the content of African American ideology, we have to go to the late 17 and early 1800s, when major differences emerged within the African American nationality over destroying the slave system. Differences first emerged during the process of the slave revolts between the house slave and the field slave. The house slaves were the slaves the Caucasian overseer trusted. They were loyal to the master and sometimes were the master's offspring from the rape of slave women. Many were raised from birth in the master's house, and as a result of the breeding system were mulattoes. You know what mulattoes are? Mulattoes, or in this, according to this, biracial people, mixed people, we call it. The chattel slave system developed a racial caste system in America. Listen to that. This is one of the parts of American history, especially that is particular and specific to us as Black Africans out here, that I don't think receives a lot of attention. And that is the racial caste system that was developed during the chattel slavery. And, it was prominent. It was a big part of our development, and still in some places and in many people still is very big, this is where we get the brown paper bag test. If you're darker than a brown paper bag, you weren't accepted in a certain society. So this caste system is very real. And like I said, it was prevalent then, and you still see remnants of it in people and in institutions, especially in America. Okay, the chattel slave system developed a racial caste system in America. At the top of the caste system was the Anglo-Saxon image. And at the bottom of the caste system was the African image. Features and skin pigmentation closest to the Anglo-Saxon determined prestige among the African captives. Read that again. Features and skin pigmentation closest to the Anglo-Saxon determined prestige among the African captives. This superimposed caste system remained prevalent within the social life and culture of African Americans into the late 19th. It may be. Is it starting to freeze? Let's continue. The house slave, treated better than the field slave and directly trained by the Caucasian overseer, was more prone to be ambivalent about the overseer and emotionally tied to him. As a whole, he sought a peaceful solution with the oppressor, one of integration, reform, or compromise. The field slave, on the other hand, was isolated from the overseer. His only contact was in the form of exploitation, brutality, and oppression. He hated the master and sought separation and a violent and revolutionary means to the end of slavery. Here we have Dr. Muhammad setting the context for the various ideologies that would emerge, that the two dominant ideologies that would emerge in the destination and determination of Black Africans here in America. And he's taking us all the way back to its historic beginning, and he traces it back to the house nigga, the field Negro. The house Negro and the field Negro. And I think that our dear brother Malcolm, who spoke on the house nigga and field nigga. If you haven't seen that, tape that in. I think everyone may have seen it, but type it into your YouTube, house nigga and field nigga by Malcolm. I think Malcolm does a wonderful job of really, you know, in Malcolm's style, how direct and straight to the point with some satire. He is in explaining this ideology and methodology, the difference between the two Black people here in America and their stations and positions and how that translates. Here we find Dr. Muhammad saying the same thing. He's talking about the house Negro who had feelings of ambivalence towards the master and was a lot more tolerant. And because of the treatment and a lot better treatment, what they're saying here, that the master trusted him and sometimes gave him the little clothes and the food, the crumbs that would fall off the table. He saw an integrationist, a conformist, a compromise. Whereas this field Negro, whom they said had very little contact with the master, and when it was a contact was in the form of exploitation and oppression and brutality, hated his master. And he saw separation and revolution as a solution. Through David Walker's appeal, and among two major insurrectionists, Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, we find their intentions were the total destruction of the slave system. Revolution. You will have these people come and try to distract you from the purpose of revolution. And here we find through David Walker's appeal, his writings, and among two major insurrectionists, Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, you will find their intentions was the total destruction of what? The slave system. Not directly the implementers of slavery, not directly white people. If you got in the way of ending this slave system, you were putting yourself on, making yourself the op, as these young people call it. You were making yourself the opposition, the opponents. But the intentions of the insurrections, the intentions of the slave revolts, they were revolution. They were waging revolution. Their intentions were to end the slave system, then establishing an African-American state. So I'm going to read that again. Through David Walker's appeal and among two major insurrectionists, Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, we find their intentions were the total destruction of the slave system, then establishing an African-American state. Historical evidence showed that Vesey was heavily influenced by the success of Toussaint L'Ouverture and Dessalines, leaders of the Haitian Revolution. The Vesey revolt was one of the first indications of international awareness and scope on the part of Black intelligentsia. How serious? It says, the Vesey revolt was one of the first indications of international awareness and the scope on the part of the Black intelligentsia. That we go back to our internationalism, our awareness of international affairs, even goes all the way back there. How international revolution, here you find revolutionary Pan-Africanism, when the affairs of his brother in the diaspora, Denmark Vesey, the affairs of what was going on in Haiti. Here we find the awareness of internationalism, international revolution, and the effects and the influences that it had. And like Dr. Muhammad is saying, the scope of the Black intelligentsia. You know, their grasp, how far they went to seek influence, and not just influences, understanding to change the condition, to overthrow the system in their very locale. And we find that what they say here, Denmark Vesey was greatly influenced by Toussaint L'Ouverture and Dessalines. The contradiction between reform, integration, versus revolution and self-determination, nationalism, was an internal conflict, even among the freedmen, captives who were freed by their masters, and those who fled from slavery or who brought their own freedom. Many of the freedmen became the leadership for the African Americans. African American class structure then was similar to now. Let me go back. The contradiction between, and we find this happening now, the contradiction between reform and integration and revolution, self-determination and nationalism was an internal conflict, even among freedmen. You would find that conflict, that solution, what we should do for our freedom, how we should end the system, or what we should do for our liberation and empower ourselves, was an internal conflict. It's one that we've always been going back and forth with. Even amongst the freedmen who have been freed by their masters and those slaves who have bought their freedom or ran away. This has always been a very big dilemma for the Black African here in America. What do we do? Do we want revolution? Do we want self-determination? Do we want nationalism? Do we want this pride and understanding and forming our own destiny in life without outside influences, hindrance and obstructions? Or do we believe that we can reform within the system, we can change, we can vote some of this wickedness out of place, or we can become such good patriotic citizens that things will naturally change? This has always been an internal conflict. And it says that the class system, Dr. Muhammad says that the class system then was as it is now. He says, one, the conservative bourgeoisie, old middle class, radical bourgeoisie, young middle class, the intellectual proletarian, which is the working class or the artisans, the writers, musicians, and intellectuals, the mass proletarian, the working class. So that's the breakdown of our class system in contemporary. Let me read it again. Conservative bourgeoisie, old middle class, radical bourgeoisie, young middle class. And this is what you see now. A lot of these so-called leaders in these revolutionary movements, or movements that should be revolutionary, are really radical bourgeoisie. But you'll get it in your political education. I just hope once you learn it, you don't start tearing these jokers limb from limb. You guys be easy once the truth comes to you. So conservative bourgeoisie, the old middle class, radical bourgeoisie, young middle class, intellectual proletarian is the working class, the artist, the writers, the musician. The mass proletarian is the working class. That's the contemporary class setup. How is that compared to then? Then it was the conservative bourgeoisie, house slaves, or conservative freemen. The radical bourgeoisie would have been equated to the radical freemen. The intellectual, I believe, was the intellectual proletarian, would have been the revolutionary freedmen. And the proletariat, the working class, would have been the field slave. This is the class, the contemporary as opposed to then, or the equivalent, is showing its equivalency in slavery. Denmark Vesey was a freedman who bought his freedom and attained a prosperous economic status, but never negated his field slave heritage. In 1829, David Walker, a free slave, wrote an appeal calling for the overthrow of the slave system worldwide. Remember these names. His appeal had electrifying results, stimulating rumors of revolt. I'm going to read it again. Denmark Vesey was a freed man who bought his freedom and attained a prosperous economic status. He bought his freedom, became prosperous, and then Dr. Muhammad tells us what? But never negated his field slave heritage. What do we used to say? Don't forget where you come from. Here, Denmark Vesey was a slave who bought his freedom, and by all rights could have kept going doing his thing, but he never forgot his field slave heritage. And he wrote a treatise, he wrote books, he wrote an appeal, and it said it was so electrifying, it had such electrifying results that it stimulated the rumors of revolt. Contradictions began to arise among the freemen, young developing African-American bourgeoisie, as they began to organize. These contradictions became apparent in the National Colored People's Convention, the first held in the United States in 1830s, among the African-American abolitionists and the abolitionist movement. A spokesman for revolution and insurrection against the slave system was Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. So you had revolutionaries back. This revolution thing isn't nothing new. This revolution thing isn't anything new. This isn't a new ideology. This isn't a new philosophy. Revolution was a part of the solution, or was put up as a real part of the solution when they first slapped shackles on us. When they first slapped shackles on us. Here we go back and we find at the first National Colored People's Convention that a spokesman for revolution and insurrection against the slave system, revolution and insurrection against the slave system, was Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Garnett updated David Walker's appeal to the Colored People's Convention and urged its adaptation. Frederick Douglass opposed the appeal as being unrealistic, and it was voted down by one vote. David Walker's appeal for insurrection and revolution was voted down by one vote. And we heard who was a proponent. We already know Frederick Douglass, respect to Frederick Douglass, was a proponent of integration, assimilation, and homogenization, I'm going to say. And he championed against that approach. And apparently he was masterful in his speech, or he was influenced, very influential, whatever the case may be. But it was vote down, revolution, insurrection as a course of action for the masses of Black people, according to the National Colored Convention, was voted down. Unrealistic, and was voted down by one vote. As frustration grew with the rate of change occurring among the freemen, Garnett's appeal was eventually adopted in 1847. Within the African-American faction of the abolitionist movement, as well as that of the conventions, were discussions of forming African colonies, as well as in Canada, and several thousands did immigrate to Canada. Returning to the motherland, Africa was also a very strong desire among the freemen. The desire to return to Africa was soon exploited by opportunistic Caucasians who saw the freemen as a threat to the institution of slavery. In 1850s, reacting to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which threatened the status of freedmen, Martin Delany was in the leadership of a Back to Africa movement. But the movement soon lost popular support when the American Colonization Society, a group of white slave owners, financiers, began advocating repatriation for the freedmen. Let me go back over that. Martin Delany was in the leadership of the Back to Africa movement. But the movement, and Martin Delany was before the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, for those of you who get our history correct. Martin Delany was in the leadership of the Back to Africa movement, but the movement soon lost popular support when the American Colonization Society, a group of white slave owner financiers, began advocating repatriation for the freedmen. The freedmen saw that the American Colonization Society wanted to use them to establish an American colony in Africa. Some freedmen did return and formed the state of Liberia. This produced the sentiment to remove the words Afro-American or African from the African-American institutions. In 1835, at the 5th Annual Convention of Colored People of America, a resolution was passed with the recommended, quote, as far as possible, to our people to abandon the use of the word colored when either speaking or writing concerning themselves, and especially to remove the title of Africa from their institutions, the marbles of churches, and so on. I think what's interesting here for me is when I'm reading all of this, and it's funny that this is some of the things they're discussing, the use of the word Africa. I like the use of the word, Black people should remove the word colored from their writings and from their dialect. But I think what's interesting here is we find before integration, before these so-called civil rights bills or us thinking that we've been accepted into this society, we actually had conventions to determine the destiny of us as a people. This is what I'm finding interesting in these readings. I'm reading the National Convention of Colored People, and then we come back to the 5th Annual Convention of Colored People of America. You know, their 5th annual. We actually had conventions to discuss. Our Black Intelligentsia would have these conventions to discuss the direction of the Black Africans here in America. And when we begin to integrate and assimilate, and bought into this individualism, or bought into the illusion of all inclusion, that we lost the desire to determine our destiny. We allowed the destiny of America and the decisions of a few white folk to be what would be ultimately our direction, social, cultural, economic, politically, in the hands of other people. I thought this is interesting. I'm like, man, we had a lot of conventions. The Civil War temporarily submerged the debate. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, when it became obvious that African Americans weren't going to be accepted as equal, the term colored became prominent in African Americans' self-consciousness. Two classical debates that occurred in the early 20th century between three men left a haunting legacy on the Black intelligentsia. The first debate was between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 1900s. And the second debate was between Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, happened in the 1920s. I think some of you are familiar with the debate of Du Bois and Garvey, not so much with Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, which I believe that debate was about, and Booker T. was advocating largely vocation as far as scholarly, something to this like this. But Booker T. Washington was a big proponent of Black people learning vocations, and then feeling as if once we got the vocations, once we showed ourselves, white folk or society, that we were capable of taking care of ourselves, that we could retain these skills and have these skills and this and that, that it would be easier for them to accept us in. His plan largely excluded. And those of you would have to read Okay. I appreciate your guys' patience, man. This thing is crazy. In fact, I'm just going to get ready to wrap it up. We'll go 30 minutes. So basically what I was saying was about the debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who Booker T. Washington advocated vocation, that Black people would show their worth once they learned the trade and everything, and that should be prioritized. That should be paramount for Black people. And W.E.B. Du Bois, whom we know was a proponent of the talented 10th and things, was on the contrary, or was on the negative of that debate. Great debate. You should go look it up. Also, the debate between Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Wonderful questions raised. I think that they are pertinent to go into political education because it helps you to formulate, your not ideology, but make your ideology sound. A lot of you have, or a lot of us have ideologies that are just given to us and they're not founded on anything, or there's nothing to substantiate them. So going back and learning the various positions and philosophies and ideologies and methodologies in which our predecessors had gone to establish Black liberation, I think is super important. So it talks about these two debates. The doctor talks about these two classical debates that occurred in the 20th century, between one debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois in the 1900s, and the second debate between Du Bois and Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. These debates were over the classical contradiction of which direction the movement should take, which is always something that we're discussing as revolutionaries amongst one another. Black Africans here in America amongst one another, because not all of us embrace a revolutionary ideology. These debates were over the classical contradiction in which direction the movement should take, and still have not been solved. Rather than debate the contradictions in the varying ideological viewpoints, we will try to describe them and establish a sense of analysis and continuity in the molding of the African American ideology. So, because you know what, we're going to attempt it. Peace and power in Yemen. We're going to attempt it. So what Dr. Muhammad does here is he's going to go into the various structures of the debates and the emphasis. Dr. Muhammad says, Booker T. Washington was a reform integrationist with strong bourgeois nationalist leanings, who believed in moderation and peaceful coexistence. His tactic of submission and moderation stemmed from his belief that was the only way African Americans could and would survive. It should be remembered that Anglo-European American labor was hostile toward the African American people during this period. So let's go back over that. Booker T. Washington, who was a reform integrationist, with strong bourgeois nationalist leanings. Now, this is why political education is important, because a lot of things just happen there. What is a reformist? What is an integrationist? Who are the bourgeois? What is a bourgeois? What about nationalists? So we're seeing here that Booker T was a reform integration. He was one whom believed in integration, but as integration in its present form was not sufficient, so he believed participating in it with the intentions of changing it would work. That's reform. Reformism is operating within the system by the measures and the standards of the system and changing it, using its procedures. So he's a reform. He believed that you could use integration to change the bad parts of integration. I guess I'm assuming, and I shouldn't assume, but I'm assuming he believed that his white friends would help him change the attitude of the less susceptible or welcoming and inviting white people. He was also a bourgeois nationalist. What is bourgeois? We understand that bourgeois was a certain class, as we went early into the teachings of Dr. Muhammad. So he was from this element, from this class, and yet he was a nationalist. So he's a bourgeois nationalist. He was from a certain class, from a certain philosophical, economical understanding, yet nationalism, a nationalist, meaning him putting his people's issues and needs, they were a priority. So, They were a priority. He also was he believed in moderation. He believed in moderation and peaceful coexistence. So he wasn't with the separation or the revolutionary talk, like you said, David Walker's appeal for insurrection or Denmark Vesey. He wasn't along those lines. His tactic of submission and moderation stemmed from his belief that the only way that African Americans could and would survive would be to embrace those philosophies. He had saw firsthand the horrors visited upon his people by white America. So he had taken this philosophy of moderation, peaceful coexistence, reformist integration, saying this is the only way that white people would accept us, or this would be the only way we should survive. And it says, Dr. Muhammad says, now it's important to remember that Anglo-European American labor was hostile toward the African-American businesses. To secure an independent economic base seemed feasible at the time. So Booker T is saying that the Anglo-Saxon European workforce was hostile towards us. They were squeezing us out of being included. We were, just the workplace was dangerous for us. But at these times, too, we see the height and the rise of Black excellence. Even participating in capitalism, Black capitalism, we see how it was advantageous to us because at this time we weren't integrationists. You have to understand they were fighting. Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington were fighting for integration. That didn't come about till years later under Dr. King and stuff. So the exclusion of our labor, the exclusion of our participating in business actually created a vacuum and a void that we filled, and we filled it successfully. History bears witness. History is replete with our success, with our turning negative conditions, with your excluding, your suppression, your oppression. We took that. You don't want us to be a part of that? Fine. And up grew Black Wall Street and other magnificent, that's the first one that always jumps off my mind, but other magnificent testaments to Black excellence and Black economic excellence and Black collectivity. So since the 1870s, small businesses had little chance to compete against large companies. Booker T. Washington felt that after African Americans had obtained capital and technical skills, they would be respected and eventually accepted into the mainstream of American life. He felt that African Americans should strive to obtain economic clout first, not antagonizing the Caucasian majority by striving for political equality. Y'all learned something about Booker T you didn't know, didn't you? Booker T, because a lot of you follow the philosophy and even method of Booker T. Washington. Our dear brother Booker T. Washington he felt as if African Americans should strive to obtain economic clout first, not antagonizing the Caucasian majority by striving for political equality. A lot of you don't believe in the politics, but believe in the money. A lot of you don't believe in participating. And I'm not a reformist. This is just a shot at you guys who teach this very confused understanding amongst our people. Screw politics, what's voting do? But yet you chase a dollar. Don't you understand this is capitalist America and that the economic system is intertwined with the political system? That the economic system is affected by political participation or lack of political participation? And when I say lack of political participation, I'm not necessarily meaning those who don't vote, but those who don't do anything counter. Who said, I don't vote, I don't do anything while we voting, and sit back and don't do anything counter. Yet chase a dollar. So, it's funny to me, but you are in good company. You're following the footsteps of good company. This is what our dear brother Booker T. Washington advocated. Economic clout, chase the economic clout, leave the politics alone. It must be remembered that Northern capitalist industrialists were instrumental in the destruction of Southern planters, as Dr. Muhammad goes on to say. the aristocrats of the chattel slave system. And as a result, it must be remembered that the northern capitalist industrialists were instrumental in the destruction of southern planters, the aristocrats of the chattel slave system, and as a result, many of the new African-American middle class had faith in the capitalist class and the capitalist system. When the northern capitalist industrialists began to attack the southern planters, began to destroy the aristocrats or the southern way of life, when they challenged chattel slavery, and this wasn't because they had some moral consciousness, that they saw the inhumane treatment, that they knew this was just inherently wrong. To own another human being was inherently wrong, and not just to own another human being, the treatment meted out. And for this to be a condition visited upon these people generation after generation after generation after generation for no other reason that they're melanated is a wrong. And for you Negroes to forget that, you bump your heads. Anywho, when these northerners, these northern industrialists, these white boys from up top, begin to disrupt the southern way of life, a lot of Black people, especially the Black intelligentsia, believe to have faith in the capitalist system. And I could see why, because to expand capitalism, to really make capitalism competitive. See, we had a big boost in capitalism when we had the free labor, when America had free labor and exploited us. It was a big boon to our capitalists, how we became one of the youngest nations. America was one of the youngest nations that advanced so quickly and made its mark on the world. So it's a very young nation compared to nations. So we find that slavery gave capitalism a big boon, a big explosion, a big push forward. And so during this time when the northern industrialists came, this is how we began to believe in capitalism. Because at that point in capitalism, in slavery, we ain't seeing none of that. We ain't hearing none of that. We don't even know about capitalism. But as we developed an intelligentsia and the northern industrialists came down, we began to believe in capitalism because capitalism we saw was destroying, launching, waging a war against this very real system that has kept us oppressed, suppressed, and in some of the most horrendous conditions faced by any human being, by any people. So yeah, we believed in capitalism, but the northern capitalists understood that slavery at this time, though it had given us a big boon, was a hindrance because the world was becoming industrialized. And we still had a large segment of our country, of this society, that wanted to use slave labor. And that was going to put, we're talking steam engine, we're talking industrialization, and they're talking still trying to work a brother to death. So it wasn't that these white folks got a conscience. They was just saying internationally, we can't compete. And we saw that and we bit into capitalism. Yeah, hell yeah. Industrialization, absolutely. It's going to slavery, hell yeah. While Marxism had been heard of, there was no intense Marxist analysis of the struggle at that time dealing with the plight of African Americans and the expanding capitalist system as it related to the realities of America. So basically saying that capitalism was in your face, alternatives to capitalism, its economic system, its political understanding was not available. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois advocated full equality, like his predecessor, Frederick Douglass, integration, full equality, like his predecessor, Frederick Douglass. He advocated agitating through peaceful direct actions for integration, voting rights, full equality, and the destruction of the Jim Crow system. This is what W.E.B. Du Bois agitated for. Full inclusion. We're going to agitate these crackers to give us all of that. Integration, voting rights, full equality, and the destruction of Jim Crow system. Now, listen, ideally, they That's right and exact. You want the right, especially when you're living in a time where you can be murdered, where you could just, I mean, and there's no repercussions. You don't have any rights. So I get it. I get the sentiment. I get, wanting our rights, wanting full inclusion, not wanting the separation, because with the separation comes a certain type of treatment. I totally get that. However, what I will say, and I think W.E.B. Du Bois late in his life had come to that conclusion, that understanding when he was exiled in Africa, that racism, discrimination, and hatred for melanated people is interwoven into the fabric of America and her institutions. So I think this is something that really has to be taken in consideration. And then, like I say, hindsight is 2020. I have the privilege of making this observation, making these statements now after. But yeah, in observing now, I would definitely say that racism and discrimination, the treatment of melanated people, the Black African here in America, is so a part of the culture. The way they treat us and how they look at us is so part of the culture that if you can't rely on the good nature of a human being to fix a system that is corrupt. The system has to be fixed in such a way that even if the nature of that human being is corrupt, it won't affect those people that are under the system. As it stands now, you can't have a corrupt individual in a corrupt system. You yourself don't stand a chance. So W. Du Bois, he advocated agitating through peaceful direct action for integration, voting rights, full equality, and destruction of the Jim Crow system. He was a militant integrationist. Never heard that before, was he? He was a militant integrationist, though he advocated cultural pluralism, peaceful coexistence with the existence of an African American culture. This is cultural pluralism. Living in the same place, but having your own culture and sometimes even political expression. It's called cultural pluralism. You live in America, but you have a culture that is unique to you as a Black African here in America. Peaceful coexistence with the existence of African American culture. While he advocated cultural pluralism and integration, he also at the same time advocated Pan-Africanism, the fraternity of people of African descent, united for the liberation of Africa and persons of African descent everywhere. Wow. Here we see W.E.B. Du Bois as a very complex figure. He was an integrationist, a militant integrationist. Means he was radical about his integrating. You're going to accept me. So he was an integrationist, a militant integrationist. And he was an advocate for Pan-Africanism. We read these people that have these ideologies and these philosophies, but like I said, I think one reoccurring theme is their attachment to their nationality. Booker T. Washington was a bourgeoisie nationalist. And one of the reasons I think that attachment to the nationality is their proximity to the very real horrors visited upon them as Black people. They're coming face to face with the demon. Too many times now, and in this day and time, the demon has easily masqueraded themselves, and we don't see the real danger of the demon. So we push and promote the illusion of the demon, luring our people, calling our people to be gobbled by the beast, by the demon. But here I'm finding Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, though I may disagree with his ideology and his philosophy, largely, very large parts of it, the militant integrationism, the coexisting type of thing, I still admire his attachment to Pan-Africanism and the fraternity of African people and people of African descent. And I strongly believe that is because of his proximity, his closeness to the horrors visited upon African people and people of African descent. The debate between Washington and Du Bois was of a rational character over tactics, militancy versus moderation, and political emphasis versus economic emphasis. Du Bois believed the economic solution was socialism, and Washington believed it was African-American capitalism. While Du Bois had been highly respected as an intellectual, the African-American bourgeoisie followed the pattern established by Booker T. Washington. Their major goal has been economic gain, and just recently has emphasis been placed on militant political action. Let me go back over that again. It says, while Du Bois was highly respected as an intellectual, the African-American bourgeoisie followed the pattern established by Booker T. Washington, Black capitalism. Their major goal has been, was, and has been now economic gain. And just recently has emphasis been placed on militant political action. That's out of David Levering Lewis, from the book W.E.B. Du Bois Biography of a Race, 1868 to 1919. Definitely. Well, listen, I'm going to conclude it here because, the whole computer thing, Wi-Fi thing, but I appreciate, again, everyone stopping in, allowing me to have my contributions to political education. I encourage all of us, those of us that are in the know, begin some political education, begin some way to inform, preferably that will inspire people to actions. And I'm at People's TV, Atlanta, Georgia, the voice of the people. Come check us out. Come get a show. Get your programming on here. Inform Atlanta of what you would like them to know. We have a podcast room. We have the live studio. I'm a producer down here. Let's get down here and doing it. Let's get down here and do it. Let's inform our people, and not just inform our people. Let's take this information and turn it into real action. And here's an opportunity to do it. So with that, I'm going to leave you as I greeted you. That's all powers to oppressed people, African power to an African people, and Black power.